Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Portsmouth Institute for our Summer Institute this year, As I Have Loved You. My name is Kale Zelden. I'm a humanities teacher here at Portsmouth Abbey School and a friend of the Institute and work with Chris, so I'm really excited to be here. But I'm really excited to be here for this talk, Festivity and Christian Love, given by Dr. Michael Foley. Dr. Foley is a professor of patristics in the Great Text Program at Baylor University in Texas, a professor of theology at the Aquinas Institute, and the author of approximately 350 articles and 14 books. Gosh, man, that's a lot, including a 4-volume series on St. Augustine's earliest dialogues. Drinking with the Saints and The Politically Incorrect Guide to Christianity are two of his titles. Mike and his wife, Alexandra, live in with their 6 children, 12 chickens, 2 turtles, 1 dog, and 12,000 bees. Michael, welcome to the Institute, and thank you so much for coming with us. And I'd also like to just quickly thank our sponsors for today's programming, and just a quick explanation of the format. So Dr. Foley will deliver his remarks, and I'll probably ask a question or so as a follow-up, and then we'll give you all in the audience an opportunity to ask questions vis-a-vis the chat. So we'll open that up after that. Please go ahead and submit your questions through the Zoom chat function, and I will get those relevant questions will pop up into my screen, and we'll pose that to Dr. Foley. So as I said, we have Dr. Foley here, and he's going to talk to us today. His talk is entitled Festivity and Christian Love. So without further ado, Dr. Foley, I give it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Kale, for that lovely introduction. As you know, I've been invited to speak on festivity and Christian love. And what I'd like to do is divide my thoughts into 3 different categories. I'm sorry that I was too lazy to prepare a PowerPoint presentation but I thought if I just told you the 3 up front, you could sort of mentally keep note. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the basic human or natural situation about us as feasters, eaters. The second thing I'd like to talk about this morning is the Christian response and elevation of basic human dining. And then the third thing is to talk about a few of the modern complications to both this natural and supernatural arrangement. So let's start with the human situation. Have you ever stopped to think about the fact that human dining is actually a rather strange thing? In this respect, eating is a very basic biological act, and yet we human beings seek to make it high and dramatic. I turn to an insight from Father Bernard Lonergan. This is a long but worthwhile quote. For human desires are not simply the biological impulses of hunger for eating and of sex for mating. Indeed, man is an animal for whom mere animality is indecent. It is true enough that eating and drinking are biological performances, but in man, they are dignified by their spatial and psychological separation from the farm, the abattoir, the kitchen. They are ornamented by the elaborate equipment of the dining room, by the table manners imposed upon children, by the deportment of adult convention. Not only then is man capable of aesthetic liberation from the drag of biological purposiveness and artistic creativity, but his first work of art is his own living. The fair, the beautiful, the admirable is embodied by man in his own body and actions before it is given a still freer realization in painting and sculpture, in music and poetry. Lonergan's basic point is that an animal pattern of biological activity is, in humans, transformed into a primordial drama that the theater only imitates. Man is the dramatic or theatrical animal, the creature who lives his life in a theater of fellow spectators like no other sentient being on earth. I can only offer one paltry proof in favor of this thesis, but it is one worth contemplating. The almost universal disdain for monophagy, which means the act of always eating alone. In 1872, G.W. Dasent wrote, "Monophagy makes a man melancholy and unsocial." Over a century later, the French sociologist and cultural theorist Jean Baudrillard visited New York City and had this to say: "The number of people here who think alone, sing alone, and eat and talk alone in the streets is mind-boggling, and yet they don't add up. Quite the reverse. They subtract from each other, and their resemblance to one another is uncertain. Yet there is a solitude like no other, that of the man preparing his meal in public, on a wall, or on the hood of his car, or along a fence, alone. You see that all the time here. It is the saddest sight in the world, sadder than destitution, sadder than the beggar, is the man who eats alone in public. Nothing more contradicts the laws of man or beast, for animals always do each other the honor of sharing or disputing each other's food. He who eats alone is dead." Strong words. Or to cite an even more recent example, as Andy Bernard confessed in an episode of The Office, "Last night I ordered a pizza by myself and ate it over my sink like a rat." The line is funny because rats, as a general rule, do not eat the pizza that they ordered over a sink, but it rings true because there is something subhuman about eating alone and without ceremony. There are two peculiarities that can be noted from the theatrical appropriation of the biological. The first is the tension between the shareable and the unshareable. Eating is essentially an unshareable act. When I bring home a pizza, there are only so many pieces to go around. But dining, eating with others, is predicated on a sharing of goods that are not perfectly shareable. Feasting lives, in other words, in the tension between what is perfectly shareable and what is not. But what is perfectly shareable? Dante has an answer. In the Purgatorio, he writes, "For when your longings center on things such that sharing them apportions less to each, then envy stirs the bellow of your sighs. But if the love within the sphere should turn your longings heavenward, the fear inhabiting your breast would disappear. For there, the more there are who would say ours, so much the greater good is possessed by each. So much more love burns in that cloister." In other words, perfectly shareable goods, the goods that are heavenward, are those that can be shared without any subtraction from the donor. Knowledge is a good example of this. If I share with you the fact that 2 + 2 is 4, I enrich you, but do not lose any knowledge of that fact myself. It is not like sharing basic facts in mathematics impoverishes me in any way. I share and am not detracted. It is curious that we yoke the unshareable act of eating with the more shareable acts of conversation, conviviality, and friendship. The second peculiarity is like that of the first. Eating is essentially a low activity in the service of the lowest part of ourselves. We eat to nourish our bodies, and then our bodies digest what we eat and discard what is not needed. If we were to discuss what the body actually does at the dinner table while we were eating, we might lose our appetite for dinner. And yet with the art of feasting, we gladly join the body's lowest functions to some of the soul's highest activities, to fellowship, to a discussion of ideas, to an experience of music, to wit and to banter, to high romance and family memories. Feasting involves an interesting marriage of high and low. Never mind that different cultures define the high and low differently. There are no universal dining rules concerning eructation, flatulence, and even evacuation. The point is that every culture has a distinction between high and low, and that dining or meal sharing always strives to unite the two. Consider one of the most delightful descriptions of breakfast in the Western canon of literature, a passage in Nathaniel Hawthorne's The House of Seven Gables. This is a quote from Hawthorne. "Life within doors has fewer, pleasanter prospects than a neatly arranged and well-provisioned breakfast table. We come to it freshly in the dewy youth of the day, when our spiritual and sensual elements are in better accord than at a later period, so that the material delights of the morning meal are capable of being fully enjoyed without any grievous reproaches, whether gastric or conscientious, for yielding even a trifle overmuch to the animal department of our nature. The thoughts, too, that run around the ring of familiar guests have a piquancy and mirthfulness, and oftentimes a vivid truth, which more rarely find their way into the elaborate intercourse of dinner." Whether or not you agree with Hawthorne's insight into breakfast, I simply draw your attention to the frequent juxtaposition between high and low, spiritual and sensual, gastric or conscientious, the animal department of our nature versus conversations that contain piquancy, mirth, and vivid truth. So, in meal sharing, the high elevates or dignifies the low. And it is also true that the low, the purely physical pleasure of tasting good food, drinking good wine, and feeling the sensation of satiety, also contributes to the high. Again, Hawthorne comes to mind in a memorable description of the sublime effects of coffee. "The subtle essence acted on him like a charmed draught, and caused the opaque substance of his animal being to grow transparent, or at least translucent, so that a spiritual gleam was transmitted through it with a clearer luster than hitherto. Making our opaque substance translucent with spiritual gleams. That is the function of a good cup of Java, and it is also the goal of all fine dining and all meal sharing. In Babette's feast, the Danish puritanical dinner guests agree not to be Epicurean or Sybaritic in their praise of Babette's French sensual delights, but they still enjoy the meal, rightly preferring wine to water. The result is a veritable sacramental event where the low is subsumed into the high, and the guests praise God in a hymn around the town well. Let's turn now to the Catholic elevation and transformation of this human experience of dining. Just as the dramatic nature of man transforms feeding into dining, so too does the new covenant transform at least one act of dining into something sacred and sanctifying. The Eucharist, instituted during the most important and solemn feast of the Jewish year, involves the consumption of a food and drink that perfectly unites the shareable and the unshareable, the high and the low. God lowered himself greatly when he became human through the mystery of the incarnation. He lowered himself further when he took the form of a servant, but he lowered himself most of all when he offered himself as our food. In the Eucharist, the Most High becomes the most low. Similarly, the Eucharist, like the miracles of the loaves and fishes that anticipated it, rewrites the rules of the shareable and the unshareable, for even the smallest particle of the host contains the entire and entirely shareable person of Jesus Christ. And in addition to the holy sacrifice of the Mass, early Christians also hosted a separate meal called the agape, or love feast, in which regular food and drink were shared in fellowship. It is noteworthy that the early church named this earthly, non-sacramental feast after the perfectly shareable and divinely infused theological virtue of agape, or caritas, even though, strictly speaking, the love feast was about the distributions of goods that are not perfectly shareable and the whetting of unshareable appetites. I suspect the reason for this appellation is that one of the aims of the love feast was feeding the poor. In the first recorded liturgical crisis of the church, St. Paul criticizes the Corinthians for not sharing with the have-nots at a love feast. Caritas, as the shareable love of God and neighbor, is supposed to elevate and transform our unshareable urges and needs. Almost 4 centuries later, Faustus the Manichaean would describe the Christian love feast as merely a substitute for the Greco-Roman religious sacrifices, which served an important social function of giving much-needed protein to the impoverished masses by sharing the meat of sacrificed animals. St. Augustine bristled at the comparison, but he nonetheless affirmed that love feasts were meant for the poor. At our agapes, he writes, the poor feed on produce or meat. That is, a creature of God is fed by a creature of God, which is in accord with human dining. We will return to Augustine's arresting statement, a creature of God is fed by a creature of God, later. For now, it is worth noting that even after the demise of the agape in the Western Church, sometime in the 8th century, liturgically centered feasting has remained a staple of Catholic life, and such feasting traditionally includes the less fortunate. To this day, the most festive season of the year, Christmas time, also remains the season most cognizant of the less fortunate. With hymns like Good King Wenceslas, stories about St. Nicholas throwing bags of coins down a poor man's chimney, and customs like Boxing Day, reminding us during this holy time of the importance of charity. And just as feasting was attached to feeding the poor, so was fasting. The great fast of Lent, for example, is not simply a means of pruning and retraining one's appetites. It is an act of charity. From the earliest centuries, the early church has emphasized that Lenten asceticism is meant to increase our love of God and our brothers in need. Money saved because of fasting, for example, should be given to the impoverished. As Pope St. Leo the Great put it, may the abstinence of the fasters be the refreshment of the poor. Or in the beautiful words of the Maronite liturgy, how splendid is fasting that is adorned with charity. Break your bread generously with one who is hungry. Otherwise, yours is not fasting, but saving. Today, if we were to summarize a Catholic theology of feasting, We might say that to, quote, eat and drink to the glory of God, as St. Paul puts it, we must begin with virtues such as moderation and gratitude, and even the old-fashioned contemptus mundi, disdain for the world, which keeps us from getting too entangled or in or obsessed with the temporal and the unshareable. These virtues, in turn, rightly reorder our love for the three kinds of things that can be loved: what is below us, what is equal to us, and what is above us. A Christian reveler, if you will, has a proper respect for the land, crops, livestock, and labor that made the meal possible, what is below. He has a love for his dining companions and all his fellow human race, including the poor, what is equal to him. And most of all, he loves and is grateful to God for all the gifts at table and beyond, what is above him. Let us turn now to modern complications to this natural and supernatural situation. We could go on and on about this topic, but I'm only going to mention three. What has happened to the family dinner, socioeconomic segregation, and something, if you'll forgive me, something called the new sex. Let's start with the first complication, family dinner. The first complication is the relatively recent decline of the family dinner. The American College of Pediatricians reports that family time at the dinner table and family conversation in general has declined by more than 30% in the last few decades. Another study suggests that the decline is not that bad overall, but that low-income families have suffered disproportionately from this trend, probably because low-income parents have less control over their work schedule. The loss of the family meal is concerning because among children and teens, it is linked to increased substance abuse, unwanted pregnancies, depression, obesity, lower academic performance, smaller vocabularies, and reduced literary skills. Among adults, the decline in the family meal correlates to poorer mental and physical health and higher divorce rates. On the other hand, sharing a meal together, even among non-related adults, enhances team performance, as we see in the case of firefighters. With respect to our theme of Christian festivity, I see two other things about which to worry. First, if the family dinner is lost, feasts will be significantly compromised. Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners are meaningful as a heightened and more solemn expression of the daily supper. What will these holiday celebrations look like, or will they even continue, when the quotidian model on which they are based disappears? Will our fellow citizens be able to enjoy each other's company on a day consecrated to giving thanks to Almighty God? Or will they simply munch mindlessly on snacks as they watch on a large flat screen TV Macy's Parade or the bowl game du jour? Second, I suspect that a decline in family dinners will contribute to a further decline in liturgical literacy and active participation properly understood. Ever since the Second Vatican Council, liturgists have debated about whether or to what degree the Mass is a sacrifice or a meal. Part of the confusion, I think, comes from a loss in understanding the rich biblical concept of sacrifice. But now, further confusion will come from no longer understanding what a shared meal is. Making additional attempts to simplify liturgical symbols or making the language even more readily intelligible will do no good if the congregation does not have a prior knowledge of the basic realities to which those symbols and linguistic signs point. If we no longer understand the basic idea of a feast, which historically was both sacrifice and meal, we will no longer understand the supreme act of worship in the Catholic Church. We will look at the communion lines as a drive-through at McDonald's and wonder why we must wait to be excused from the dinner table with the priest's ite missa est, instead of more efficiently consuming the host in our cars on the way home. The solution to this crisis is, of course, to encourage family meals. For decades, Harvard's Family Dinner Project has been trying to help with various resources, including a website that offers recommended dinner recipes and conversation starters. Perhaps the Holy See could grant a partial indulgence to the family that dines together and a plenary indulgence for inviting a poor stranger or the family's most obnoxious friend, neighbor, or extended relative. In the latter case, truly a heroic act of charity. A second complication to Christian festivity is the result of what Maria Montessori calls, quote, the isolation of the masses of the poor. Montessori contends that prior to the 20th century, rich and poor lived cheek to jowl, and that this arrangement made it easier for the rich to be kind to the poor, as we see in the childhood stories of the kind princess who sends help to the poor cottage next door, or of the good children from the great house who carry food to the sick woman in the neighboring attic. Today, our monofunctional zoning laws, combined with the economic principles of the real estate market, make it less likely that rich and poor live in the same neighborhood or even attend the same parish. This form of segregation makes it more difficult to exercise traditional expressions of charity. To give one example, there is an old custom from the south of France that one cannot eat the Christmas loaf until one has given a quarter of it to a poor person. If I were to practice this custom today in my adopted hometown of Waco, Texas, I would have to drive miles from my suburban home, either to the downtown in hopes of finding a homeless person, or to a bad neighborhood and risk getting shot at. And not without good reason, for I would surely look insane or menacing as I drive around waving a quarter of a loaf of measly bread, trying to give it to strangers. I do not have a solution to this problem, although I do think, at the very least, that it is good to be mindful of it. The practice during grace of remembering the less fortunate offers prayers for them, reminds us of their needs, and gives us another reason to be grateful for what we have received from God's bounty. I have saved the most complicated complication for last. In 2009, in an article entitled, "Is Food the New Sex?" Mary Eberstadt astutely observes that the contemporary West has reversed its morality concerning food and sexual intimacy. Whereas previous generations were relatively indifferent about what foods they ate and morally exacting about the use and abuse of the procreative act, today's progressive citizens have a growing list of morally charged verboten about food and a shrinking list of morally forbidden venereal acts. Put bluntly, Eberstadt concludes, we live in an age of mindful eating and mindless sex. Mindful eating includes opposition to eating flesh meat or endangered fish, to industrialized breeding and farm factory slaughtering, to genetically modified fruits and vegetables, and to pesticides and other artificial agents. It tends to be wary of gluten, trans fats, and dairy products, and fond of such terms as organic, free range, grass-fed, and sustainable. Mindful eating is not necessarily opposed to what we might call traditional sacramental eating, but it does complicate matters. The new focus on both the morality and health of food turns the simple and unifying act of breaking bread into an endlessly divisive ethical quagmire. Aside from health concerns, I must now worry about how the animals I eat were treated when alive and how they were slaughtered. What impact the pesticides used on my produce have on the environment, and whether the workers who harvested my crops for me were fairly compensated. These are valid concerns, and I do not belittle them. Indeed, I contend that it is even worse than most people think. If I choose to be vegetarian because I deplore the methods of modern commercial ranching, I must still consider the insects killed by harmful pesticides to protect my produce and the effect of these chemicals on the soil, the water, and the thickness of birds' eggs. If I eat only organic vegetables, I still know that vegetables, like animals, have mortal souls. They are alive, and that I have taken a life in order to save mine. If I eat only fruits and nuts, which were never alive, but only the products of living plants and trees, I must still acknowledge that these gardens, crops, and orchards are protected by a system of violence, by birds that devour depredating insects, by hunters who keep deer and feral hog populations at bay, and by a military-industrial complex that keeps our agricultural lands safe from invasion. It is always the case, as Augustine puts it, that one creature of God feeds upon another. And east of Eden, this feeding is tied inextricably to a world that is red in tooth and claw. Or to put it simply, no matter how hard we scrub our organic apples, there is still moral dirt on them. I believe that there is a partial solution to this complication and a more complete solution. The partial solution is to privilege food that you yourself have raised or harvested, such as fruits and vegetables from your garden, and animals that you have farmed, ranched, or hunted. And yes, I add hunting. Although it is a blood sport, in today's world of factory farming and industrial slaughterhouses, it is arguably more ethical to hunt for your food than to shop for it. And when you serve up something that you have hunted or farmed, there is an extraordinary sense of memory, humility, and gratitude, for you know more than anyone else what it costs to put that food on the table. I call this partial solution the Wendy Barrell solution, in honor of a powerful statement of his. This is Wendell Berry. To live, we must daily break the bread and shed the blood of creation. When we do this knowingly, lovingly, skillfully, reverently, it is a sacrament. When we do it ignorantly, greedily, clumsily, destructively, it is a desecration. I am fond of the Wendell Berry solution, but it is only a partial solution in my opinion because not everyone can practice it. The more complete solution is what I call the Saving Private Ryan solution, which I name after Steven Spielberg's 1998 blockbuster. In the movie, several men die in order to save the life of Private James Ryan, played by Matt Damon. The dying words of the last man, Captain John H. Miller, Tom Hanks, to Private Ryan are, "James, earn this, earn it." Decades later, an old James Ryan stands in front of Miller's graveyard and says, "Every day I think about what you said to me that day on the bridge. I tried to live my life the best I could. I hope that was enough. I hope that, at least in your eyes, I've earned what all of you have done for me." I bring up the example of Private Ryan not in order to draw a moral equivalency between the death of soldiers and the consumption of meat, but to put things in perspective. Like it or not, we are the beneficiaries of blood shed for us, from the fallen heroes of our armed forces to Jesus Christ on the cross. If a pig or a cow or even a carrot must die in order for us to live, then let us make our lives worthy of their sacrifice. There should be something humbling about being on top of the food chain. Rather than making us arrogant and triumphant, it should fill us with a sense of unworthiness and humility and purpose. For to whom much is given, much is expected. I once asked a rancher friend for a goose so I could have it served on Christmas Day. The friend consented on one condition, that I slaughter and dress the goose myself. He wanted me to be part of this humbling experience. When my wife thanked him for this gift, he replied, "Oh no, it is an honor for this goose to end up on the Foley's Christmas table, rather than to die of old age or from a coyote." An honor. I'm sure that if we asked the goose, he would probably tell us that it is an honor he would rather forego. But nevertheless, it is an honor, an ennobling act for the lower to participate in the higher. And when goose flesh becomes human flesh, it becomes part of a temple of the Holy Spirit. This is true even when goose flesh nourishes thieves and other scoundrels, for even they continue to bear the imago Dei, and their bodies continue to participate in this ontological dignity. And it is especially true for those who are holy. Imagine the great honor bestowed upon the little lamb that was our Lord's Last Supper. Both science and common sense tell us that animals, including us rational animals, must take life in order to nourish our life. Rather than bemoan this basic fact of life, let us live our lives worthy of these sacrifices. Let us eat in order to keep the animal department of our nature healthy and vibrant, and let us live in a way that our position as apex predators bears spiritual fruit. One of the benefits of mindful eating is that it beckons us to a higher calling of taking from the lower as we receive, assimilate, and communicate the higher. Goose flesh has become your flesh, and your flesh has been incorporated into the Eucharistic flesh of the risen Lord. Let us earn the sacrifice that our Lord and his creation have made for us. Let us become angelic lovers, fueled on Eucharistic, animal, and vegetable life. Thanks.
That was great, Dr. Foley. Great stuff. I don't know if I can speak for the audience, but my mind is going a mile a minute with a bunch of the things you laid out. I was struck originally from the front end of your essay by calling us feasters or eaters, and I know you teach the great books or great texts. Maybe that's a conversation for another time at Baylor. I've always wondered when I taught the Odyssey. I've always been struck by the fact that Odysseus's orders always seem to be go and see if these men are eaters of bread. And I wonder what kind of, I would riff on that with my kids all the time. And I always saw it as a kind of proto-Eucharistic take. But anyway, I don't want to cheat too much. I mean, what do you make of Odysseus's command to search for eaters of bread?
Well, what's fascinating is, and the other criterion, he's trying to see who is civilized.
Yeah.
He's trying to separate humans from subhumans. And so, yeah, one of the criteria is, are they eaters of bread? The other criteria is,
Right.
Do they fear the gods and show hospitality?
Right.
So even I kept linking Christian feasting with concern for the poor, but it was a pre-Christian thing as well.
Yeah.
There's something, it's such a funny thing, this paradox that eating is an unshareable act, and yet feasting tries to make it as shareable as possible, including incorporating the outsider.
Yeah.
It's an interesting tension.
Yeah, no, it really is. Before I continue, I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions for Dr. Foley, please go ahead and put those into the Q&A, and I'll be sure to hit those in just a minute. I'm struck at the end, Dr. Foley, you were talking about, of course, the necessary connection. You know, you talk about the goose that your friend offered, but first you had to sort of engage in the sacrifice. And I sort of do this quick little mental image of you doing it. Then, of course, I quickly put myself like, how would I do this thing? And why is it? I love the idea that of participating in the sacrifice, even though the goose, perhaps, if we could pull him aside, say, well, maybe not this time. Why? And then, of course, this reminds me of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he is pleading essentially with his father for this sacrifice to pass him by. And I wonder what you make of that. Why do we always seem to rather not sacrifice?
Uh, well, it's that basic instinct for self-preservation.
Mm,
I mean,
mm.
this ties into the thing about high versus low.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, it's a part of our animal nature to seek our own self-preservation. And that's not a bad thing. Obviously,
right.
there are some modern philosophers like Hobbes who elevated that principle way too high.
Uh-huh,
There are higher things than self-preservation,
right.
and the high must again govern the low. But that doesn't mean the low is bad.
Right.
That doesn't mean that there's something wrong in seeking to preserve yourself. So even our Lord is an example of this. There's a way in which you could say his animal nature was recoiling as he contemplated the
Right.
tortures of the cross, and it was an honest question, an honest petition.
Yeah.
But he continued to let the high govern the low,
Mhm.
and doing the will of God over his instinctive desire for self-preservation.
Yeah, that's right, and again, perhaps as a sort of model for us, you know, as we make our own sacramental attempts, small s sacramental attempts to unite the high and low amongst us and within us. It's a fascinating sort of tension that we sort of uh, seem to, or a fulcrum that we seem to rest upon at all times. We're sort of balancing back and forth quite a bit. Um, all right. Well, I'm going to ask a question from the audience. I do have other questions, but I don't want to crowd out. Mad props to bringing up Andy Bernard and Baudrillard. I'm very pleased with that 1-2 punch. That's very solid. So anyway, this is a question from the audience, and it's: how can Catholic schools, primary, secondary, and colleges create spaces for festivity? It seems to me that residential schools especially have a chance to remake time to allow for festivity. But to go back to the question, how can Catholic schools create spaces for festivity?
Well, great question. Um, yeah, that is something that puzzles me as well.
Mm, mm,
Because on the one hand, I get mad at Catholic schools that follow the secular calendar more than the church calendar.
yeah, yeah,
So, they'll have spring break, but not Easter week. Or, they'll have school on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception.
yeah,
The Feast of the Immaculate Conception, it's a holy day of obligation. We should also have to have the ability or privilege to abstain from servile work.
yeah,
And, teaching and learning it aren't exactly servile, but still, you get a day off, you want to celebrate. On the other hand, if we gave our students the day off on, say, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, they might not. How are we teaching them festivity? Because they just go home and maybe their families celebrate it, maybe they don't.
hmm,
So I guess I would say maybe one thing is to take the church calendar seriously, and on high feast days, maybe do half day at school,
hmm,
have it end with a glorious mass, and then tell the kids, go home and tell your parents, make merry. This is a
yeah.
feast day. I don't know,
Yeah.
maybe something like that.
Yeah, it's so easy to sort of fall into the kind of functional trap or the transactional trap, right? You know, we're going about our days and we're going about the business that we have to attend to. But we don't seem, we don't mind vacation days, but we seem to mind a day in which we gather and we quote unquote waste it. And so, what about a sleep in and a late start and a mass and I think there's some hesitancy to all of that. But I wonder in this regard, it's very hard to understand what it is to feast when we are surrounded and submerged with such largesse. I mean, when's the last time, I was hungry? I mean, really hungry, that I really went without. I'm having a hard time, finding one. And so therefore, how does that curb or retard my appreciation for these things? We hear all the time, oh, it's the feast of such and such, and it's the feast of this, and it's the feast of that. That word just sort of goes right by us, doesn't it?
Oh, you're absolutely right. And you brought up something that I didn't have time to do in the paper, but one of the peculiarities of feasting in the modern age is that we don't cherish it as much because none of us living Americans have truly experienced food scarcity.
Yeah.
My dad lived through the Great Depression, and he still had memories as a boy, but I think that generation has by and large passed on. Maybe war shortages, but that hasn't happened really since World War II.
Right.
And when you don't have that experience of a food shortage, food scarcity, you will appreciate the feast less because you've got food on demand 24/7.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem to register in quite. Not that you, of course, wish that people would, radically go without, like the food shortages you mentioned, in a place like, for instance, in Britain during World War II, during the Blitz. I mean, I certainly wouldn't wish that on anybody, but it does have this curious way of allowing us to see the sort of the standalone, the holiness of the holy day of obligation. It's sort of this special set aside part. So I do have another question from the audience. This one is from Lauren. She says, Jesus shares himself as our bridegroom, saying, quote, "It is consummated" on the cross. He is both food and lover, giving himself totally, and feeds both our animal drives. However, although he gives himself to us as food literally and physically, we obviously do not physically engage in the marital act with Jesus when receiving the Eucharist. So what does this say about our drive for sex? Why does God feed this drive in a hidden spiritual way in the soul and not physically, materially? That's a tough one.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Great question.
It is.
I guess I would say the one thing that food and sex have in common, which also intersects with the Eucharist, is that with both of these appetites, the desire is to, in a sense, make the object of your desire as much a part of your body as possible.
Yeah.
So that happens literally in the act of eating. I eat the hamburger, and the hamburger becomes a part of my body.
Right.
It happens mystically with the marital act, and the two shall become one flesh. I say mystically because I'm not saying the scripture is false. There is a way in which marriage makes the two one flesh, but I also look around and I see that my body is still different and separate from that of my wife. Right. But the Eucharist is interesting because in the Eucharist, you eat it, but there is a certain consummation that takes place, and the two do become one flesh. But the interesting thing about the Eucharist is, instead of this food becoming a part of my body, I become more deeply part of the body of Christ.
Yeah.
It's the food that I eat that then assimilates me into it. That's a very unusual food, but that's also a very profound union.
Yeah, and it seems, I think, to anticipate, the Hyros Gamos, right? It anticipates the ultimate consummation of God marrying us as His church, right? That doesn't, literally happen. Again, that's such a modernist framing word there. It doesn't literally happen in marriage or in the Eucharist. It's mystical, as you say. So it's um, I don't know. There's some interesting thing going on there. Um, yeah, it's a good question. But I think, perhaps in part, I remember reading that Eberstadt piece when it came out a decade ago or so
Yeah,
ago,
yeah,
and I
yeah.
remember it had been, it's one of those articles that you read that had been kind of like, I've been thinking about this. People are all concerned about organic this and natural this and free range that, and people seem to care in a moral way about what you eat. And I really saw this when my kids started school. And I remember at one point, one of the teachers, we had to bring in a certain amount of things. We were in charge of snacks that week or something. And there was something like, please do not bring in anything with, high fructose corn syrup, or please do not bring in anything that has any, dyes or anything. And I just remember being like, God, they're really talking to me like this is some sort of, there's some moral valence here. Like I am not living up in a very moralistic way to the demands, and yet if you flip the script as Neberstadt does, and but have sex with whom and whatever you want. I mean, whatever. Who am I to judge? is the sort of the crack there.
Oh
But
yeah, that's a complete inversion. It is a great article,
yeah,
and I every now and then I've recommended it to my students,
yeah.
and then I thought of it when this topic came up, and
Mm.
it's been years since I read it, and I reread it, and I was like, wow, there's so many great insights that I'd forgotten that she had made. And she has a gentle touch. She
Yeah,
come
she
down and
does.
say, oh, this is just awful. He's just noting a
Yeah,
sociological shift,
yeah.
and it
And
is
it, yeah,
sociological.
and it's incontrovertible. I mean, you read the piece,
Yeah,
you're like, yeah, that's true. That's actually true. I can't argue with that.
yeah.
Okay, I do have a third question, Dr. Foley. Um, when considering fasting, we tend to think of it as a discipline that we need to instill.
Hmm.
Could the same be for feasting? Our appetites, both literal and figurative, may not be in the mood for festivity at any particular time. Therefore, our need for festivity becomes an act of the will. So, what say you? This idea of feasting as a discipline.
Yes. Well, you do know that's the original purpose of the cocktail. Is
Okay, well, this is right up your alley. So, I was hoping it would come up. So,
there's a really funny 1930 essay by Chesterton.
uh-huh.
The cocktail was a big sort of American thing, especially
Yeah.
from Prohibition. And 1930, Chesterton wrote an essay called "The Cowardice of the Cocktail." And what he didn't like about this notion of a cocktail was that it was supposed to be used as an aperitif,
Yeah.
that you weren't in the mood for dinner. And so the cocktail was supposed to arouse your interest for dinner. And Chesterton's reply was, I need no such.
I'm always ready to eat, right? That's funny. That's funny.
When you've seen photos of the girth of the man, like, yeah,
Yeah,
he probably didn't need a cocktail to
yeah,
be ready for dinner.
that's right.
But that's a good insight. And one thing I don't get a chance to talk about in the paper is that, of course, with true feasts, not only does it require a certain discipline to go to them, but it's stressful. It's stressful to prepare a feast.
Yeah,
Let's be honest.
it is.
Christmas and
Yeah,
Easter can be really stressful times, especially on mom.
right. That's right. That's right.
And yeah, it does it's just weird. It sometimes requires a special sacrifice and a special discipline to get to the point where you can have a festive time.
And I would add this, Dr. Foley. Oftentimes, for somebody like myself, I can imagine no thing that I would rather do. Honestly, I was a made for feasting kind of guy. In fact, I even tried to write a senior thesis about this back in my college days. But for some people, they don't like to spend 3-4+ hours at a feast. I mean, it is a gift of time to each other and to the person preparing the meal. I'm reminded of those scolds at the Babette's feast. They're like, "We're not going to talk about it. We're just going to we're going to grit our teeth through this." But but at any rate, that it is a sacrifice. It's not all fun, and as you say, certainly for the people preparing it. And so anyway, okay, I do have a fourth question because we're getting close to time here, and I don't want to crowd anybody out here. From Adele. Oh, and by the way, the Mary Eberstadt article that Dr. Foley referenced is in the chat. So if you want to click on that, that would be a recommendation. And the movie we keep talking about is Babette's Feast. It's also fantastic. You really should watch it. All right, from Adele. How has the pandemic affected us regarding feasting? It appears more people paid more attention to eating, baking, cooking, mixing cocktails in general. So what do you say about that?
Yeah, I would say number one, it depends on what part of the country you're living in and what kind of restrictions were put in place. Here in Central Texas, I can say it helped our family activities. We were already homeschooling, but it made our lives more family centered.
And I've heard that a lot. I've heard that a lot of my friends whose kids do go to school, that they were sort of, they were thankful that the pandemic is drawing to a close, but they knew that they were getting stolen time back, which was an interesting way for them to say it. So
and there was a fascinating article on the impact of COVID on hunting. Hunting licenses among teenagers went up 90%.
Wow.
Because fathers finally had time to teach their sons how to hunt. And one other thing, Harvard's Family Dinner Project, which I mentioned in the article, the co-founder I can't remember her name, but she's a professor at Harvard, and she also mentioned that there are studies that showed that family dinners went up as a result of the pandemic. So maybe that habit will stick. Maybe that'll be one of the good things to come out of this crazy time.
Yeah, no, that's great. No, I think that's right. We certainly, we're compelled to do it as well. It's, it's sort of a downside. Of course, it depends upon what your situation was in terms of the pandemic, working, et cetera. All right, last question, then we're going to wrap this up. Quote, ritual hospitality and the sense of guests as honored guests, the understanding of what it means to be a host are in decline. Many seem to have the attitude, I've invited you to be here and share what we're having. I'm not going to make a fuss. It's all about simplicity here, end quote. How do we reverse this? Or should we not try?
I like that.
That's a great question. Yeah, I like that.
When we have a priest friend over, we always say, "Oh, Father, sit at the head of the table."
Yes.
And so that's the way we do it. But but how to do it more consistently and with others, I'm not so sure. I think it's especially complicated question given the fact that we are in a democratic society. So you've already got less of a thing about rank and distinction going on. I would say at the very least, make your guests feel welcome. Greet them at the door. When they come in, get out of your seat and walk over to them. I've had situations where, I've been invited to a great place. The mom had everything laid out beautifully and sumptuously. And then the host, was in the backyard, and I finally found my way to him, and he was just sitting there drinking a beer, and he said, "Hey, that didn't make me feel welcome." I mean, even though the food was fantastic and the wife was very hospitable, but he wasn't mean, but he did not make me feel welcome. So I would say just those simple signs of enthusiasm for would go a long way.
Yeah, I think you're getting at manners. I mean, manners, mediate the passions, and they honor. There are mechanisms by and through which we honor one another, and we do live in as you say, a very leveled world where, manners. I don't have to sort of pay obeisance to the Lord of the manor, because, he works at the local place and I work at the local place, so we've lost a little bit of that sort of that ceremony. So I guess maybe the argument is, please go ahead, stand on ceremony. It's important. And I think we Catholics do get that. I mean, we still do processions and the show, so to speak. It's not just for show. It's actually a way of honoring the thing. It's a way of honoring what we're marking. All right. Well, sorry that I got the last word, Dr. Foley. I didn't intend on that, but I just want to thank you on behalf of the Institute for coming and sharing your thoughts with us. I want to thank all the participants in the audience for their great questions. And I want to remind everybody that we are gathering this evening at 7 p.m. for some for further conversation. So please do that. All right. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. God bless.
Thank you.